Hi everyone, thanks so much for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. Before we bring on tonight's guest, if you've had a Dogman encounter and would like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. If you've had a Sasquatch sighting and would like to be a guest on Bigfoot Eyewitness Radio, please go to bigfooteyewitness.com and submit a report. All right, let's bring on tonight's guest. Tonight's guest is Rob. Rob, welcome to the show.
Good evening, Vic.
Hey, thanks for coming on and doing this, Rob. I really do appreciate it. Rob, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, I am a carpenter by trade. I also spent a number of years back in my 20s teaching scuba diving. I've lived both on the East Coast and the West Coast. Originally born on the East Coast, transplanted to the West Coast when I was 10, and spent about 35 years living out there. And recently, about 8 years ago, moved back to the East Coast and continuing my carpentry trade back here.
From our conversation in the it sounds like you couldn't wait to move back there.
Oh, absolutely. As a young boy, I was introduced to fishing and trapping and hunting at a very early age. And the area where I was born, which is Cooperstown, New York, a lot of that was available. And the scenery around here is just so beautiful that being dropped into a concrete jungle like Los Angeles was a major culture shock for me back at that age. Took a long time to actually get comfortable being out there. And actually wasn't until I started diving that I really started finding some happiness out there. Being out, in nature and enjoying the outdoors the way that I do.
Well, I'm glad you're at least able to find something that you're able to do out there and enjoy, so I guess that's at least one positive about moving out there. In 2017, you became obsessed with listening to cryptid-related shows. Why did it take so long for you to become interested in them, considering that your encounter happened 11 years before that?
Well, to be honest, I wasn't really aware of the podcasts and things like that were out there. I wasn't really computer savvy for a long time. Having been born in the 60s, the whole technology phase of reality kind of took us by storm in a very short period of time. So it wasn't one of the things that I just, was comfortable with. I was more an outdoor kind of guy, hands-on, tools in my hands. I was always good with that. Technology just wasn't my forte. So it wasn't until I started, moved back here and had a lot of time on my hands during the winter. Being a carpenter, there's not a lot of carpentry work out here in the winter unless it's indoor work. It gave me time during the winter months to peruse things that I hadn't experienced before, and came across Sasquatch Chronicles and Dogman Encounter shows and really got hooked on them. In so doing, it brought back memories of things that had occurred in my life that led me to question what actually took place during those circumstances, which was what prompted me to call you in the first place.
Well, I'm sure doing that brought back some good memories, but some bad ones as well, as we're going to talk about in just a bit. Before you contacted me, you weren't sure the creature you encountered was a dogman. What makes you think it might have been one?
Because of its speed and agility, given the circumstances that took place. I used to actually have a wolf. It was a hybrid, but he was like 93% pure timber wolf. And he had been clocked before at 45 miles an hour running down the road. And that was like, he was being chased. So that was like his top speed. And that was when he was full grown. So, given the fact that this encounter took place and this creature was moving at least 65 miles an hour, it led me to question the validity of what my mind had remembered it being. So I thought it'd be best just to question, somebody who's experienced and has more knowledge of these creatures than I do.
Well, I'm so glad you reached out to me. From what I understand, your encounter happened close to Death Valley. How close were you to Death Valley where you had that encounter?
Well, to be honest, I'm not exactly sure the distance between the Owens Valley and Death Valley. I do know that on an annual basis, they do a marathon run that starts in Death Valley, and it starts at nighttime, obviously. I believe it's in August, and it ends in Whitney Portal, which is the tallest mountain in the contiguous United States. It's like 14,600 feet, something like that. And, it takes them roughly like a 20 to 24-hour period to do that run. So that's on foot. I don't know the exact distance between where it occurred and actual Death Valley.
When you think about how that area is, it's so hard to imagine that things like Dogmen could be out there, but they do pop up in places where you'd never expect them, so it's, I guess, not that hard to believe. Before you tell us about your encounter, Rob, please tell us more about the place where it happened.
This occurred in Owens Valley, which runs along the eastern Sierras. It's an incredibly long valley, runs roughly about 70 miles from just south of a town called Olancha, all the way up past Bishop, California. There's a highway that runs through this valley on the western side of the valley called Highway 395. And it runs basically from the Mojave Desert all the way up to Reno, and runs through places like Mammoth Mountain, which is a big ski resort area, and that's kind of just north of the Owens Valley. The southern part of it, you have China Lake Air Force Base, or it's either Air Force Base or Naval Air Force Base. There's always jets and stuff flying overhead. The valley's not terribly wide. I think it's probably, I don't know, averages like 5 to 10 miles wide, but it's incredibly long. And part of that valley is the Owens Lake, which used to be an inland sea, basically. It's a dried up brine lake. When they started taking water out of that valley and built the aqueduct system there to ship the water down to Los Angeles, that particular lake, which is what the Owens River runs into at the south end of that valley, dried up, and it left all kinds of, there's soda ash, there's all kinds of pollutants, and the wind blows in a wicked manner in that valley, sometimes 60, 70 miles an hour. And all the dust on the top of this dry lake will kick up into the air and literally be blown, 5 states to the east, or used to be anyway, before they started mitigating the dust problem. But it was a huge problem, and Department of Water and Power of Los Angeles has been sued by everybody and their brother, including, the Sierra Club and all these other organizations, to take care of the problem, because in that dust there was all kinds of pollutants, arsenic and lead and mercury, and all the things that are carcinogenic to living beings. So it's been a big problem, ongoing problem. They've spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars to try and repair the problem. And my presence in that area happened to be working on one of the phases that was occurring in order to mitigate that dust pollution.
After I spoke with you that first time, I took a look at that Owens Valley area, and wow, that's some wild-looking country. All right, Rob, please tell us all about your encounter. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
Okay. So back in 2005, I was working as a construction foreman for a construction company on this dust mitigation project. We were working on the Owens Lake. They were building roads across the lake that basically kind of turned into levees on the surface of this lake, which was rather difficult in and of itself, because the lake had like a 30-foot thick layer of just kind of like sludge on the top of the whole surface. And, as a new layer would be exposed, it turned to dust and fly off every time the wind blew. But we were pouring concrete head gates that allowed passage of water from one side of a road raised levee to another side of of that levee that would allow them. And they were also, putting in what they called bubblers on the surface of the lake that would allow them to move water from one area to another to keep the surface wet and moist to, again, keep the dust problem down. We were nearing the end of the job, and I was asked by my boss to, with another gentleman that worked on the site, he was a heavy equipment operator, to move some of the equipment that was on site to another job site for this construction company that we worked for. And that job site happened to be in Las Vegas, which was a good 4-hour drive from where the job site was. So we said, sure. We showed up about, our normal start time, I believe, was like 6 or 6:30 in the morning. And we took off and we left. We drove all the way to Vegas, towing a trailer full of tools that we weren't going to need anymore, dropped them off at the work site that this company had going somewhere else over in Vegas. And we left and we drove back, and the route took us both going and coming back through Death Valley. It was the easiest access point from where we were. And we drove all the way back. We were a few miles from the job site. I mean, somewhere within like a 10 to 15 mile range before we got to the job site. And we came across an accident on the side of the road. It was a family that were in a vehicle, and there really wasn't anything around this particular area that would have been causeworthy for these folks to have had an accident. There wasn't another vehicle involved. It was just their vehicle was on its side, off in the desert, maybe 20, 30 yards off the side of the road. And so we stopped, to make sure that they were okay, that nobody needed help. And they assured us that, somebody was on their way, and we just wanted to make sure nobody was hurt. And it seemed kind of odd to us. It was like we offered our assistance and they said, no, we'll be fine. And we took off. But, in the process of doing so, my partner and I were just talking about it. It was like very odd that this vehicle was just tipped over on its side, on the side of the road on the way to, they were headed toward Death Valley. We were headed back from Death Valley. There just didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason for them to be, on their side, on the side of the highway. And we had discussed it, and it was like, well, there was no rhyme or reason for us, but, we had no idea what had occurred. It just seemed strange to us, and their behavior just kind of like blowing us off as far as, making sure that they got somewhere or got the help they needed. Just didn't seem to fit the circumstances. So we left it, and, we continued on. We got back to our job site, and it was the end of the day on a Friday. So we had the weekend coming up, and, after just spending 8 hours basically driving through the desert, I was anxious to get back to town and have some beers and wet my whistle, because it had been, a long, hot day and dry. But we got to the job site. We both jump out of our trucks, grab our paychecks. And I got into my vehicle and took off. I started heading toward town and got probably from where the job site is to the town where I was keeping my trailer. It was between 22 and 25 miles from the job site, straight up 395. And I had gotten 3/4 of the way there and realized that I had left my wallet at the job in the truck that we had taken to Vegas. And it was like, darn it, now I got to drive all the way back. It's Friday evening, I was anxious to, start enjoying my weekend. And I had a dog at the time. He was a chocolate lab. His name was Jedi. And he had been in the trailer all day by himself, hadn't been let out. And I had to go pick him up first. So I drove all the way into town, picked up Jedi, headed back to my job. It's roughly a 20, 30-minute drive when it's all said and done, one way, just to get back and forth. So it was getting later in the day. The sun was starting to drop over the western side of the Sierras. And I remember it being ultimately a really dark night that night, but it was still light at the time that I got back to the truck to get my wallet. And I got to the job site. I went to the work truck, grabbed my wallet. There were a couple of guys that were still working in the mechanics section because there was a lot of heavy equipment and stuff that was on this particular job. Excavators and loaders and, water trucks and all kinds of things that were constantly needed to be worked on. So we had this little mechanic section. There were a couple of guys who were still working over there in the mechanic section, but everybody else was pretty much gone for the weekend. So I got there, I got the wallet, went to leave the job site. Jedi was in the front seat laying down. I drove out of the parking lot from the job. Now, the road that runs along the job site runs east to west. And it's actually the same road that takes you to Death Valley, but it starts right on 395 in Olancha. And it's about a 3-mile section of road between the job site and Olancha. And in the middle section of that road, there's a curve I seem to recall it being at least a half a mile from the job site. So when you come out of the job boneyard, which is where all the trailers and everything are, and they stage all the equipment, you make a right and you're on this road. And I don't remember the name of the highway, but it's the only road out of Olancha, which is right there on 395. So not easy to miss. So I left the job site. I turned right onto this road. Now, the majority of this road is arrow straight. And, it's very easy to get up to, you're out in the middle of the desert. It's always very easy to get up to 60, 70 miles an hour. No problem. It's just how people drive in that kind of, that type of terrain. You don't expect anything, so, you step on it and, you're of course trying to get from point A to point B in the quickest manner possible without speeding too much. But at the same time, you don't really take your time doing it because oftentimes there isn't much more to see but more tumbleweed. So I turn right on that road. I step on the gas. I'm anxious to get back to town. And I start speeding up. And as I'm speeding up, I notice movement out of my right eye, off to the right side of my truck. And the movement causes me to look over to the right side out the passenger window, and I see this canine figure, which is really large, colored very similar to a coyote. The tan and the white and the gray colors, that coyotes tend to have out on the West Coast, and it's moving it's running straight at my truck, and I'm thinking, Christ, this thing's going to run right into the side of my vehicle. And it doesn't. When it gets right to the side of the road, which is just a few feet off the side of my vehicle, it turns to the right and starts paralleling my truck. And by this time, when I first saw it, I was almost to 60 miles an hour. By this time, I'm up to at least 65 that I remember. And it's running the same speed as my truck. I'm looking at the back of this thing out my passenger window. I can see the hair movement. I can see some of the back muscle movement. By this, the only time that I actually saw the face of this was when the creature was actually running straight at my truck out of the desert. And that was for just a very brief moment because it was like it just appeared, out of nowhere. And as once it turned and it was paralleling my truck, I was flabbergasted that this thing was so fast. I could not believe that it was keeping up with my truck. At the time, I had that window down, and it did. I had never heard of Dogman. I had never really wasn't. I'd heard of Bigfoot years ago, but I really wasn't aware of other cryptids out in this world. It never dawned on me that this was anything other than a really large coyote that was fast as all get out, that, was able to stay up with an F-250 4x4, fully loaded, 460 engine, tons of power, and running the same speed as the truck. And I was so blown away by it that I wasn't paying attention to my driving. I was looking at this out my passenger window. And it finally dawned on me after a number of seconds, and I really can't tell you how long it must have been, 5 to 10 seconds maybe, that I was watching this, that I didn't have my eyes on the road. And then it dawned on me, I better look at where I'm going to make sure that nobody's coming at me and that I'm not going to crash, And it just so happened that when I turned my eyes back to the front, I was coming right into a curve on that highway. It's one of the only curves on that highway. And at the speed I was going, normally I would have slowed down for that curve. I was driving it every day, twice a day, there and back from the job, to and from the job site. There must have been something in the back of my head that said, hey, remember where you're at. Because I just happened to look back right before I hit the curve. And when I hit the curve, I hit it going too fast, and I started to lose control of the truck. The rear end of the truck started to slide out to the right, and I corrected, but apparently I overcorrected because now it was going back the opposite direction, and didn't seem to be, no matter how much I tried to correct the other direction, it wasn't stopping the momentum of the truck completely starting to spin around to where I was facing the opposite direction and sliding off what originally was the right side of the road at the same time. And as it slid off the right side of the road, there was a mound of sand that was kind of parallel to the road right there. And my two wheels on the driver's side hit that mound. And the next thing I know, I'm flying through the air in a barrel roll. Jedi, who was in the truck, obviously not strapped in, I happen to have my seatbelt on, was flying all over the cab. I got hit in the head several times, both by him, and then when the truck landed on the cab at one point, which smashed the whole cabin and blew all the glass out of it, that hit me from above. My head hit that, and it did two complete barrel rolls, two complete 360s, and came to land on all four wheels. I won't say tires, because two of the tires were completely, the same two that hit the berm, the tires were completely blown off the rims. All the glass was out of the truck, glass everywhere. When I came to a standstill, I was the only one left in the cab. Jedi was gone. I had no idea where he was. I was obviously very stunned. I, got conked on the head. Wasn't bleeding or anything like that, thank goodness. As far as any injuries, it was just minor bruises and scrapes and things like that from the glass, and no serious injuries. But obviously very stunned, and I had to release my seatbelt, and I couldn't open the doors, either one of them, because they were crushed in. So I had to crawl out the window. And by the time I crawled out the window and fell onto the desert floor, my only thought at that time was, where is Jedi? And I was afraid I was going to find him crushed in the sand or laying dead out there somewhere. And I started walking around and calling him and looking for him, calling his name, and he was nowhere to be found. I was starting to it was interesting because by this time, I guess I was just from being in shock, time kind of stood still in my mind. But in reality, I have no idea how much time elapsed, because by the time I realized that I couldn't find him and had been walking around calling his name, looking for him, and being concerned that the creature that I'd seen on the side of the road just before the crash had gotten a hold of Jedi, and couldn't find him anywhere. I'm getting frantic by this point, and I decided to walk back over to the road, which is I'm guessing about 30 yards away at this time. Not terribly far, but I'd also walked around quite a bit, hollering his name and thinking he'd run off into the middle of the desert somewhere just out of fear, or who knows, I couldn't find him. I didn't know what happened to him. So I walked back over to the road, and by this time it's getting dark, and I see headlights on the road that runs by my job site heading toward me, kind of from the job site. So I stood in the middle of the road and flagged down whoever it was, and it turned out to be one of the mechanics from the job site heading out, for the weekend. He was done working, and when I began to talk to him, I was rather frantically just in shock and saying, "I can't find my dog. I can't find my dog." And he's giving me this look like, "Who are you standing out in the middle of the desert, a few miles from nowhere, and looking for a dog?" And I guess at that point he hadn't noticed my truck off to the side in the desert, crunched. And I pointed over at the truck, and he saw it, and he saw, that the vehicle had been in an accident, and the hood was crushed, or the cab over was crushed. And he goes, "Was that you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he looks back at me. He goes, "You been drinking?" And I said, "No, not at all." He goes, "What happened?" And I said something about a dog or a coyote, and that I was trying to find my dog, and I needed to find my dog. And he goes, "Well, you got to get your truck out of there, dude. Cops could give you some trouble for this." And I said, "Well, I hadn't been drinking, so I couldn't understand why they'd give me trouble." But he offered to take me back to the yard and to pick up a loader and go back and drag my truck back to the yard, so it wasn't just a vehicle sitting out in the middle of nowhere distracting people, I guess, as they drove by. So he had me jump in his car, and we turned around and we went back to the job site. And to be honest with you, I was in such a state of shock at the time. I don't remember if I rode back with him or followed him back with the loader to get my truck. I just remember that I was sitting at some point in the yard there on the job trailer steps, and Jedi came running up to me out of the desert, out of nowhere. And it had to have been at least a good, half hour, 45 minutes later when he finally showed up. And it was like, that was just such a huge release. I think I kind of probably burst into tears at that moment. And, was just so thankful that he was okay. He had a couple of scrapes on him and was crying, I think, just from the experience of the whole thing. And, it was just, I was just really thankful that he was safe. And it was a tremendous amount of relief when he showed up. And the gentleman that helped me, to this day, I don't remember his name. I don't know that I ever even got his name. Came pulling up with my truck and parked it. And the strange thing is that he lived the opposite way of where I did. He lived, I believe, down in Ridgecrest at the time, which was a good 60 miles south of where we were. So he wasn't going to go 20 miles out of his way to head north on 395 to take me back to town, which I had no other ride somehow. And I don't remember if he drove me back to Alancha to get a ride, but somehow Jedi and I ended up in a guy's semi truck that was headed north on 395, and we made our way back to town. The rest of the evening, in fact, I think the rest of the weekend turned out to be a bit of a blur because it just was such an unusual experience and happened, just out of the blue, and this creature paralleling my truck at 65 miles an hour out in the middle of nowhere was just astounding to me. It was like, I had only bought this truck just a couple of months before this, and to me it was, a new truck. It was beautiful. It ran great, had low miles on it, and got it for a great price. And, here I was without a vehicle now, and just had this unbelievable experience, and saw a similar accident earlier in the day that just made absolutely no sense, with a family standing there dumbfounded about how their vehicle was on its side in the middle of the desert. Now I understood, it was like I couldn't believe it. And in fact, when I made it back to work the following Monday and talked to the gentleman that had drove with me and told him about, actually I didn't have to tell him about it. He saw my truck in the parking lot. But, he wondered how it happened. And I told him about this thing that I thought was a coyote at the time. That was an incredibly large coyote. I mean, the fact that the sill of the window of my truck had to at least been 4 feet off the ground. So to look out the window and see the back of this creature outside my window, just a few feet off the side, it had to be huge. I mean, it had to be massive. It didn't dawn on me back then that coyotes don't get this big. Wolves don't even get that big, It just, for some reason, I just painted it in my head that it was a coyote. But when I look back, especially after, listening to so many Dogman encounters and stories of cryptids, and understanding what kind of speed and agility and strength they have, it wasn't until just recently that it dawned on me that this might not have been a normal run-of-the-mill coyote canine critter out in the desert. Anyway, that's the gist of the whole story.
How far was your job trailer from the spot where you crashed that day?
It had to have been somewhere in the neighborhood of between a quarter and a half mile away from the actual boneyard where the trailer was, where there's one turnoff. If you go on Google Maps and you look and you find Alancha on 395 and you take the one road out of Alancha to the east, you'll see one minor curve in the road, but then one that's a little bit sharper curve. I mean, it's dead arrow straight until you get to that area. And then you go past that larger curve, it's at least a quarter to a half mile, and you'll see where the old boneyard was, because there's still like a parking lot area there that's very distinct, and it's on the south end of the Owens Lake. But it had to have been at least between a quarter and a half mile from the actual driveway point where the job site was to where that curve was. And it's dead straight till you get to that curve. And so it, doesn't take but 200-300 yards to get up to, 60 miles an hour. And it was just normal driving for me. It was something I did every day. That's how I knew that the speed I was going was, the normal highway speed for those highways, because it's just, you just don't do 25, 30 miles an hour and they take you forever to get anywhere. But it was remarkable. Very remarkable.
Oh, I'm sure it was. And if you crashed that close to the job trailer, yeah, it's no stretch to think that Jedi didn't have any trouble finding you. Thank goodness he was okay, too. Yeah, that would have been really bad if he did get hurt. After flying around the cab of your truck the way he did Jedi have any long-lasting psychological effects?
Absolutely, he did. One, he didn't want to ride in my truck anymore. I had a new vehicle the following week, managed to find another used vehicle that was a decent price, and he wouldn't go anywhere near it. In fact, he didn't. I had to pick him up and literally hold him the whole time when we climbed into that semi truck after the accident, just to get back to my trailer, which was 25 miles up the road, and he cried the whole time. From then on, he wouldn't step foot in my truck. At the time, I had been separated from my wife, and we were in the process of getting back together. And she was in LA visiting her sons and lived in Mount Shasta at the time. And she had to drive from LA back up to where I was just to pick Jedi up, even though I was going to be meeting her in Shasta to go start getting things settled, because, like, as I said, the job was beginning to wind down. Even if I'd had a truck, she would have had to still come get him, because he wouldn't go anywhere near it. And if you tried to put him in, he would go nuts, absolutely nuts. He permanent lasting, driving effects for Jedi with that one. It was unfortunate. Fortunately, physically, he was, for the most part, probably just bumps and bruises, but psychologically, forget it. He wouldn't go anywhere near a truck after that.
Well, after having an experience like that, I can't blame Jedi for having an aversion to riding in trucks. Please describe the creature you saw that day for us as accurately as you can.
So, from the very start, after noticing the movement out of the corner of my eye, out of my peripheral vision, I looked out my passenger window, and as I stated, this canine creature, which had a fairly large head, had pointed ears, more toward the top of the head. It was running straight at the truck. In fact, it was running what looked like it would have, if it had gone straight, it would have ran right into my passenger side door, the front door, because this was a quad cab. And it was quite large. I mean, it was massively agile, but that was the only moment that I actually had roughly a 1 to 2 second window to see the face. After that, it turned to the right and was literally outside that passenger door, running alongside the vehicle. And from that point on, all I saw were a couple inches of the back sticking up above my windowsill of the passenger side of my vehicle. I could notice a bit of a hump on the back, like as it was running, and it would lurch forward. I mean, this all happened in just, a few split seconds. Lasted, well, ultimately about 10 seconds, as it was paralleling the truck much longer than it was running toward the truck. It was literally only about a second or two after noticing the movement out of the corner of my eye of this thing coming straight at me. Then it was moving alongside the side of the vehicle and paralleling me as I'm driving down the road. All I could see at that point, I couldn't see ahead because there's the blind spot of the front part of the window there where, it comes down from the hook, from the cab over down to alongside the windshield. Yeah, that was all blind spot. All I'm looking at is the mound of the back of this thing out the side of my passenger window, and the hair, which was roughly 2 to 3 inches long. Every time it lurched forward with its, what I assumed was, its front legs, the hair would kind of, and the legs would come back, the hair would kind of stand up, and then as it lurched forward, it'd lay back down, and then, and then the movement, the level of the back would alter in elevation in the window from a couple of inches above the sill of the window to about the midpoint of the window. So it was taking extremely large strides, obviously, one, to maintain the speed that it was, because it was hauling rear end, And I didn't notice if it had a tail, because by the time I was done being flabbergasted at the presence of this thing outside my vehicle, it dawned on me in my head that I had to turn back and look at the road to make sure I knew where I was going. And that's when all chaos ensued, so it was very difficult to perceive or notice any extreme details of this, other than it looked canine, it was large, and it was incredibly fast, and it had similar color markings to that of a coyote. I do remember the fur, though, like on what looked to be like the hump, being of a darker coloration, almost like a deep, dark red. But then I remember lighter tans to it, too. It was like that deep, dark red toward that front ridge moved to a lighter tan as it moved toward the side, and then there was like kind of a grayish color behind that, more toward the middle of the back. It was definitely taller toward the front of the animal than it was toward the back, because I remember seeing the majority of the body of the back toward the front of my window. I don't remember seeing so much of it toward the rear of the window. In other words, it was like a lower elevation, or it might have been lower than the sill of the truck, but that kind of hump section of the back, which was right there at the front of the window, was higher in elevation than that lower section. But that's where I was able to see the detail of the hair and the length of it and the movement of it. And I mean, like it was yesterday. The detail of it stuck in my mind far, far greater than I had imagined.
Well, I can only imagine the thoughts must have been going through your head at that time. Wow. You said it was quite large. How much would you say it weighed?
That would be a tough guess for me, Vic. I'd venture, had to be at least over 200 pounds. I mean, as a hunter now and taking deer that average between 150, 200 pounds, and seeing their size and being familiar with their size and being familiar with this, it was probably closer in the neighborhood of 300 pounds, but it happened so rapidly. I couldn't judge, I never saw like the bottom of its chest, I never got like a full view of the body or the size of its legs, or it was just, it was almost like there were two brief moments of visualization of this. One was the first part of it running at the truck, which gave me no view of the body really whatsoever. It was just the head coming at me with front legs, and then portion of the back, outside the window. So rather than make something up, I'd prefer to say that it just would be impossible for me to tell, with this having happened, what was it now, 14 years ago that this took place. And the brief memory, and not even recognizing it as it being possibly a cryptid at the time and thinking it was just a coyote, it would be impossible for me to tell in an accurate manner how much this thing weighed. I mean, just from what I saw, I'd have to say over 200, only because of the height of it. But it's still, it's so vague based off of the images that I have in my mind that it would be tough for me to say.
Well, considering all the factors involved, it's totally understandable why it would be hard for you to say. So, yeah, no, I totally understand. When it was running alongside your truck, what was Jedi doing?
Honestly, Vic, I don't remember. To be perfectly honest, I don't remember. In fact, I don't even remember seeing Jedi while looking at this. I don't know if he was he must have been asleep on the seat or just laying down and not aware of its presence, because in my visualization, in my mind's eye, the picture of remembering what I was looking at, Jedi wasn't in that picture. And he was laying right there on the front seat when I left the job site. So that's a really good question. In fact, it really surprises me because I don't remember him being in my visual perception when I was looking at this thing. Neither when it was running at me or when I was looking at its back outside the window. I honestly couldn't tell you what he was doing or where he was because I honestly don't remember.
Well, I don't think anyone could blame you for having tunnel vision while experiencing something like that, so yeah, that's understandable. Were your windows down when it was running next to you, or did you have them up and the AC on?
I had the passenger window down. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't remember if mine was up or down. It was getting toward the evening. Normally they would have been up because the air conditioning worked great in that truck. Earlier in the day, normally it would have been up, but I think because it was dusk at that particular time. I mean, when I had actually pulled out of the parking lot from the job site, it was still light. The sun had gone down behind the Sierras, but it was still light. I could still, it was still light enough to see everything. But I did have the passenger window down. The fresh air felt good, and it wasn't hot that time of year. I seem to recall it was October when this occurred, and that was getting close to the end of this job. I believe the job ended for me in November. It was only a few weeks before the end, in fact. But I did have the windows down. They still ended up getting broken from rolling on, the truck was such bad shape when it was all said and done. It was like I couldn't believe it was, my beautiful truck is toast. But yeah, all the windows had smashed in it, both, even the ones that were rolled down. The back windows, I believe, from the rear doors were up. But yeah, well, I remember the fresh air blowing on my face. That much I do remember. So I think both windows had to been down.
Well, it goes without saying, after going through such a horrific crash, I'm so glad both of you came out okay.
Well, thank you, Vic. I appreciate that. It was, it was just such a stunning encounter. I mean, when I look back at it now, after having talked to you about it and reliving the emotions of that, I remember it's the shock of what took place was so much more than I remembered it being. I guess we just, have a tendency to shut down certain things that occur to us that, tend to be traumatic for us. For the longest time, I thought, oh, I just had an accident, it wasn't a big deal until I began to think back and remember the circumstances and how traumatic it was in that moment. And, the trauma of possibly losing Jedi. And I was only supposed to be babysitting him for a few days, Yes, I had helped raise him, and, given the circumstances and having been separated, at that time, he wasn't living with me there. It was just, on a normal basis, it was too hot in that valley, especially through the summer months, for him to live with me. So he had stayed with my ex. But it was, I felt like I got the responsibility of taking care of Jedi for these few days, and I up and possibly kill him in an accident in the middle of the desert, watching some weird creature out the side of my window that was just completely unexpected. I was frantic. And I think I was more afraid for Jedi than I was myself. It was like I didn't even it didn't even dawn on me that I might have had any kind of internal injuries or anything like that. It was like, my first thought was for him and where is he and is he okay? And, spending every second from then on trying to find him and call him. And by the time I got done, I do remember this, by the time I got done and got back to town, I had no voice left. I was in shock. I had no voice left, and it kind of stayed that way for a few days because I'd been screaming his name, out in the desert for however long. It had to have been, I'm thinking more like in the neighborhood of an hour to an hour and a half from the time I crashed to the time I actually saw him again. And in that time frame, I was manic. It just, emotionally, it had really taken its toll on me, and I didn't realize it until just recently, having gone back and lived through the event and the circumstances and whether or not that other creature had, gotten a hold of Jedi and run off with him. It was just, there was so much of it that are broken pieces in my memory that, like, for example, not seeing Jedi on the seat as I'm looking at this thing out the window, not knowing what he's doing. I have absolutely no recollection of that. It's like there's parts of this whole circumstance that got lost to time, and the trauma and the shock of it all kind of took certain parts of it and put it somewhere in the back of my subconscious, and I just haven't dealt with it or haven't been able to bring it back to the forefront of my memory. So,
Well, like I told you before, I'm so glad you got him back. Thank goodness. When you climbed out of your truck, how much focus were you putting on finding Jedi compared to finding out where the creature had gone?
In that particular moment, Vic, my 100% focus was on Jedi. I had completely forgotten in that moment about the creature. It was as though it just like erased it from my memory. I mean, as soon as I climbed out of the truck, I was calling for Jedi. I was walking all through the desert within 100 yards of my truck. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cough there. I was walking within at least 100-yard radius of my truck everywhere, and I couldn't find him. I was just calling his name and looking. And by this time, it's starting to get dark, and I didn't have a flashlight with me. So this is, there's no city lights. There's no street lights out there. There's no nothing. It's just pitch black. And the only light that I could see was way off in the distance of the one vehicle that was leaving the job site. And I didn't even know that it was leaving the job site because it was far enough away. I couldn't tell where. It was like it just came into view. And that was the only light that I saw. Behind me, or the direction that I was heading, you can see lights up on the hill, but it's rather difficult when you're in a terrain where the terrain actually kind of rises off in the distance. When you're looking at a set of mountains, which is what you are from that position, if you're looking to the west, it's very difficult to ascertain the distance of those mountains. They could look like they're 5 miles away when they're 25 miles away. And off in that direction, you had the lights of Alancha, which are just a handful of houses and a small restaurant. But when you look the opposite direction to the east, which is where the job trailers were and all that, there was nothing, no light whatsoever. So I'm scrambling around in the dark here, calling for Jedi. I'm getting frantic because I can't find him. My vehicle's crashed. I didn't know that anyone was still there at the job site at that point. I knew they were there when we got back from the day of driving, but I don't think I knew they were there when I picked up my wallet. And by this time, I didn't think anybody was there, and the shock of this was like, I didn't expect anybody to be out there. I was going to have to walk to 395 and try and hitch a ride. I mean, this is what's going through my mind, but I can't leave without finding Jedi. And I'm thinking I'm going to be spending the night out in the desert looking for my dog. So when these lights showed up, it was like, thank God, I might be able to get some help here. And even better, it turned out to be the mechanic from the job site. And, he helped me way more than I expected in that particular moment. So that brought some relief to the circumstances. And what a huge relief it was, because not only did he get my truck back over where I didn't have to think about it for the weekend, and he also put me in a position where Jedi was comfortable enough to come back around me, and be with me. As long as I was away from that truck, he was cool, he was not going anywhere near a truck anytime soon. I can tell you that.
Oh, I'm sure he wasn't. While it's unfortunate you crashed your truck that day, thank goodness for the good luck you did have. After all, you did get Jedi back. But having said that, it says everything about the intentions of the Dogman when you consider the fact that it had you dead to rights when you crashed. I mean, if it wanted to, it could have taken you out on the spot, but it didn't. I'm not sure if that's been lost on you or not.
In fact, Vic, I'm aware of this now. When I look back at the accident that I'd seen earlier in the day, these people were standing outside their vehicle. Their vehicle was totaled. It was laying on its side, literally, probably not more than 10, 15 miles where my vehicle was. And I can't swear that this is what happened to them. It just didn't make any sense for their vehicle to be in that position off the side of the road for no reason. There was no other vehicle involved. It wasn't like there were high winds or anything. It just didn't make any sense, until later that evening when it happened to me. Yeah, I'm sure somebody else had been driving by and seen my vehicle laying off on the side of the road, rolled. In fact, like I mentioned, the first words out of the mechanic's mouth were, "Have you been drinking?" It's like, no, I have not. I haven't had a drop. I sure wanted to be, but I hadn't had a drop at that point. So there had to be some other motivation for this thing, because obviously it didn't want to eat me or Jedi, or we'd have been dinner on a platter. The state of shock that I was in, the fact that I was walking around the desert out in the middle of nowhere, hollering for Jedi in the dark, could have taken me at any point, and the same thing with Jedi. He's running around the desert trying to get away from the truck and find some place of safety and comfort in an area that he'd never been to before. It wasn't, as I said, it wasn't until I got back to the trailer that he came running out of the desert. He wanted to be away from whatever it was that had just happened, just as I did. And that critter could have taken either one of us in any point along that time frame, from the time we crashed, all the way up until the time the guy showed up with it, the mechanic showed up on the road to give us a hand.
Well, I'm glad you realized that. Like you said, yeah, it could have definitely taken you out if it wanted to. Well, it's about time for us to get out of here, Rob. But before we do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
Just that it amazes me after so many years to look back at this and recognize that this wasn't some puny little coyote that was, that are normally half the size of the wolf that I had come running out of the desert at 65 miles an hour. And looking back at the memories that I actually have of it, the actual visualizations that have come back to light, it's given me a lot more clarity. And I want to thank you for that. And want to thank you, for being gracious with your time and helping me to understand the circumstances behind what took place. It actually helps me too in regard to the time that I like spending out in the woods and knowing that, in the majority of these circumstances, when people run into these things, that they're not out to harm you, that they're more in the realm of terrorizing and taunting you than, actual physical harm. And, I can tell you, the past couple of years being out in the woods that my head's been on a swivel while being out in the woods. I usually hunt alone, which, isn't the smartest thing, but when you don't have other people to do it and you love doing it so much, that's what you have left, So I'm looking forward to being able to, get back out there and spend more time in the woods and enjoy, some peace of mind while I'm out there, knowing that even if I were to run into one, that the likelihood of it turning into a dangerous encounter is far less than what I perceived it to be.
Well, I'm so glad you realized that. Yeah, like I told you the first time we spoke, that's going to be key in your ability to bounce back from this and actually enjoy yourself out there in the woods again. Well, thanks again so much for coming on the show tonight and telling us about that experience, Rob. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you again, Vic.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks again so much. Have a great night. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmenencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you.